"Mom, we're full." That was all she said. For clipped words, delivered without hesitation, as though she had rehearsed them. My daughter's voice, once soft and musical in childhood, carried a blunt edge that morning. The phone pressed against my ear felt heavier with each second that passed in silence. I could hear the bustle behind her, the clatter of pans, the laughter of grandchildren, the rise and fall of voices that belonged to people who shared my blood but not, it seemed, my presence. "We're full." The words burrowed deep, sharper than any knife I'd handled preparing turkeys through the years. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat and forced something polite through my lips. "Of course, darling. I understand. You have your hands full. I won't trouble you." She gave a quick exhale, not even relief, more like impatience. "Thanks, Mom. We'll talk later." And then the line went dead. The house around me hummed with a silence so profound it seemed alive. My hand, still gripping the receiver, trembled slightly, not from age but from the sudden vacancy that phone call carved into me. The morning sun was spilling through the curtains, pale and cold. Outside, a leaf skittered across the porch, its dry scrape the only reminder that the world hadn't stopped spinning, though inside me something had shifted. For a long while, I stood in my kitchen, the phone still in hand. On the counter lay the cranberries I had simmered the night before, their ruby skins split and shining with sugar. Beside them, a pie rested beneath a towel, cooling overnight, its crust golden and flaking at the edges. I had risen early to baste the turkey I had bought, smaller this year because I knew there would not be many around my table, but still large enough to honor the day. And yet, despite all my quiet preparations, all my attempts to cling to ritual, it had ended with that single phrase, "We're full." The turkey sat unroasted. The pie waited uncut. And I waited, suspended in a moment of strange disbelief. It is an odd thing, the way exclusion feels. It is not merely loneliness. Loneliness is an absence you can explain, a partner gone, a child away at college, an empty chair that once held a loved one now past. But exclusion carries weight. It says not only that you are alone, but that someone decided you should be. It takes what might have been coincidence and brands it as deliberate. And that morning, my daughter had marked me with it. I tried to distract myself with small tasks. I folded the towel draped over the pie and placed it carefully on the table. I wiped the counter though it did not need wiping. I smoothed the wrinkles from the tablecloth that had been laid the night before, ironed as though guests would notice such things. My hands moved, but my heart stayed rooted in the echo of her voice. When at last I sank into a chair, the clock over the stove read just past 9. Families across the neighborhood were stirring, ovens warming, children tumbling down staircases in pajamas. I imagined the laughter, the crowded tables, the smells of sage and butter and pumpkin. And then I imagined my daughter's house, my daughter, who once clutched my hand so tightly crossing the street, now closing her door to me because she was full. The sting of it came not from surprise but from the familiarity. This was not the first time I had been set aside, though never so bluntly. Over the years, invitations had dwindled. Excuses had been offered. Busy schedules, long drives, the children's commitments. I told myself it was the way of life, that families grow, that adult children form their own traditions. But traditions, I thought, should not mean erasure. I rose again, unable to sit still, and went to the cupboard. From it, I pulled 2 plates, the ones edged with faded gold leafing I had saved for holidays. My hands did not shake as I set them on the table, one across from the other. I laid down 2 forks, 2 knives, 2 folded napkins. I did not fully understand why I was doing it, only that it felt necessary, a gesture against the hollowness pressing in. When I had finished, I stepped back and looked at the setting. 2 places, though I was only one. Perhaps it was madness, or perhaps it was defiance. But as I stood there, I whispered softly, "You will not eat alone today." At 10, I slipped on my sweater and opened the front door. The November air rushed in, cold enough to sting my cheeks. I turned on the porch light, though the sun was high enough that it seemed pointless. Still, I wanted the glow there, a beacon of sorts. To whom, I didn't yet know. I simply wanted light, a sign that despite the rejection, I remained here, waiting, willing. I closed the door softly and leaned against it, listening to the faint hum of electricity coursing through the bulb outside. My table sat waiting. My heart, bruised though it was, beat steadily. And I found myself breathing through the ache, trying to summon strength from somewhere deeper than my disappointment. What does a woman do when her own family says there is no room for her? What becomes of the mother who is cast aside on the very day meant to celebrate gathering? These questions turned over and over within me, heavier than the turkey resting in its pan. By noon, the scents of roasting from other houses drifted through the air. I stood at my window, watching shadows of families move behind curtains, their laughter carried faintly on the wind. I did not roast my turkey. Instead, I brewed tea, pouring it into the chipped cup I had used for decades. I wrapped both hands around it and let the warmth sink into me, steadying the chill that exclusion had planted in my bones. As I sipped, I thought back to the Thanksgivings of my own childhood. We had so little then, just a cramped kitchen, a wooden table scarred with knife marks, potatoes stretched with milk, and pies that sometimes burned at the edges because the oven was unreliable. Yet, we were never full. There was always room for someone. Neighbors, a cousin passing through, a widow from church, chairs were pulled from every corner, benches dragged in, children squeezed together so another plate could be set down. It had not been about space or convenience. It had been about belonging. And now, in this quiet house, with its careful settings and prepared food, I realized belonging had been denied to me. The day stretched long. I spoke aloud at times, to no one, just to hear a voice echo back in the rooms. It's all right, I told myself, though it wasn't. You'll manage, though I didn't know how. Each word fell heavy in the air, dissolving before they could convince me. As afternoon slipped toward evening, the weight of the empty house pressed harder. I wondered if my daughter thought of me at all between the chatter and clatter of her crowded table. Did she pause to wonder what her mother might be doing, or if I had eaten? Or did she sweep me from her mind, content that her polite dismissal was enough to ease her conscience? The answer, I feared, lay in the silence of my phone. No second call came. No message. Just the hollow quiet, deepening with each passing hour. By the time I lit a candle at my table, darkness had gathered outside. The porch light glowed against it, a faint circle of warmth in the night. I sat down before the 2 plates I had set, my heart heavy, but a strange determination burning beneath the sorrow. This is where it begins, I whispered. Not the meal. Not the day. But something within me. I did not yet know its shape, but I felt its spark, the refusal to be erased, the quiet promise that exclusion would not be the final word written upon my life. And so, with the candle flickering, the porch light glowing, and 2 empty plates before me, I lifted my fork and began. The candle's flame burned lower as the hours crept past, its wax pooling into a shallow dish. I ate little, more for the symbolism than the hunger, a forkful of pie, a spoonful of cranberries. The turkey remained untouched in its pan, almost accusatory in its silence. I sat across from the second plate I had set, watching the candlelight glint against the empty fork and knife, imagining for a moment who might have filled that chair if life had been different. When I was younger, I had believed that age would grant me certainty, a steady circle of family, a secure place at the table, a role that was unshakable. Yet, here I was, in my own house, invisible to those I had birthed and raised. And the certainty I found was not comfort, but clarity. I had been dismissed. Not accidentally. Not circumstantially. But decisively. It was around 8 when I rose and blew out the candle. The flame sputtered, then smoke curled upward, leaving only the glow of the porch light to break the night. I washed the 2 unused plates and set them back in the cupboard, their faint clink sounding louder than it should. My house returned to its everyday stillness, but something within me refused to settle back into the same rhythm. I went to bed that night, pulling the quilt to my chin, but sleep did not come easily. My daughter's words looped endlessly, replaying with cruel precision, "We're full." I wondered at her tone, casual, unflinching. Did she know how deeply those words would cut? Did she care? Perhaps she thought I would shrug it off, understanding like I always had. That was my role, wasn't it? The quiet mother, the accommodating one, the woman who took whatever scraps of attention were offered and smiled with gratitude. But the years of small slights came rushing back. The birthdays where I was invited only at the last minute, after plans had already been made. The times she had forgotten to call, explaining later with a vague apology that she had been busy. The Christmas when she told me not to bother with gifts because the children had enough already. At each turn, I had swallowed the hurt, smoothing it over with excuses of my own. She's stressed. She's overwhelmed. Families change. It isn't personal. But it was personal. On Thanksgiving morning, she had made it so. I must have dozed eventually, because when I opened my eyes the next morning, pale winter light was spreading across the ceiling. The house smelled faintly of roasted turkey, though I had never cooked it. The bird still sat raw in its pan, but my mind conjured the ghost of every Thanksgiving past. The scent was memory, not reality. And that realization stung all the more. I rose and moved through the house, each room echoing with a kind of absence I had never before named. For the first time, I did not rush to sweep it away with busyness. Instead, I let the emptiness stand. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and allowed myself to feel it fully, the ache, the rejection, the hollowness. It was uncomfortable, but honest. By midday, I found myself staring at the turkey again. I had two choices, leave it to waste, or cook it. And though the idea of roasting it for myself felt almost absurd, I decided on the latter. The act, I realized, was no longer about the meal itself but about me. So I salted it, slid it into the oven, and let the warmth fill the kitchen. As hours passed, the rich aroma spread, seeping into the walls, the curtains, my hair. It was a strange kind of comfort, proof that life still moved forward, even in solitude. When the bird was done, I carved a small portion and sat down again at the table. Just one plate this time, no second place set, no candle. I ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the quiet resolve that had carried me to this point. In the days that followed, life slipped back into its ordinary pattern, but I was not the same. Something had been dislodged within me. I found myself turning inward, questioning the shape of my relationships, the expectations I had clung to. Was motherhood meant to end in this quiet banishment? Had I given so much of myself that now, with nothing left to offer, I was dispensable? At first, the thoughts threatened to swallow me. But then I remembered moments long buried, times when I had once lived for myself. As a young woman, before children, I had loved long walks in the crisp air, sketching the bare trees against a winter sky. I had once taken pride in baking not for duty, but for joy. I had once sat in the library for hours, losing myself in novels, traveling the world through pages when my body could not. Somewhere along the way, those parts of me had been boxed away, overshadowed by my role as mother and caretaker. Perhaps, I thought, it was time to open those boxes again. That week, I began small. I pulled out an old sketchbook from the back of my closet, its pages yellowed, its spine cracked. I sat by the window with a pencil and let my hand wander across the paper. My lines were shaky, unpracticed, but as the graphite marked the page, I felt something stirring, not quite joy yet, but memory. The following day, I walked to the park down the street. The air was cold, but the exercise filled my lungs with life. I watched children chase each other across the playground, their cheeks flushed pink, their laughter cutting through the sharp air. Their parents huddled nearby, sipping from coffee cups, wrapped in scarves. No one looked at me, and I realized I did not need them to. The act of being outside, of moving beneath the sky, was enough. On the third day, I went to the library. It had been years since I'd stepped into that quiet sanctuary. The smell of books hit me like a wave, paper and dust and the faint trace of ink. I ran my fingers across spines, titles familiar and foreign, and selected one almost at random. I sat in a corner and read until my eyes ached, transported by someone else's words, reminded that there were countless lives beyond my own. Each of these actions was small, almost trivial. But together, they formed a thread, weaving me back to myself. Still, the ache lingered. At night, when the house was dark and the quiet pressed in, I thought of my daughter. I wondered if she lay awake, too, if some small part of her regretted those words. But no call came. No apology. Only silence. And so, I stopped waiting for it. Instead, I began speaking aloud to myself in the evenings, not to fill the silence but to claim it. I told myself stories, recounted memories, even whispered promises. "You will not disappear," I said once, my voice steady. "Not like this." The first Sunday after Thanksgiving, I dressed in my best coat and went to church. I had not been in months, perhaps years, too easily swayed by excuses of fatigue or weather. But that morning, I needed the presence of others, not family, but community. The pews were filled with familiar faces, some older, some younger. A woman I barely knew smiled at me and squeezed my hand as she passed. It was a small kindness, but it nearly undid me. As the hymns rose around me, I felt tears prick at my eyes. Not of sorrow, though that was there too, but of recognition. Here, in this space, I was not full or not needed. I was simply present, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, I made a quiet ritual of returning each Sunday. I did not announce it to anyone. It was mine, a practice of belonging I claimed for myself. And slowly, a thought began to grow, fragile at first but insistent. Perhaps my daughter's rejection was not the end of my story, but the beginning of another. Perhaps, in being pushed out of one circle, I might discover another, drawn not from blood but from choice. The porch light became my symbol. Each evening, I turned it on, not waiting for anyone but reminding myself, the light is yours to give, and you can choose where to shine it. December arrived with its gray skies and early nights. The world outside my window glittered faintly with the first dustings of frost, each morning a pale breath upon the grass and rooftops. For most families, December meant gatherings, Christmas trees, the warmth of fireplaces crowded with stockings. For me, it meant a sharper reminder of distance. Thanksgiving had left its mark, and though I moved forward in small, deliberate steps, there were moments when the ache of exclusion returned so suddenly that it caught my breath. One evening, as I walked past the houses in my neighborhood, I slowed at the sight of families decorating. Ladders leaned against gutters, strings of lights looped from hand to hand, children pointing excitedly as bulbs winked on one by one. At one house, I saw a father lift his daughter onto his shoulders so she could reach the highest branch of a tree, carefully setting the star in place. I stopped on the sidewalk, my breath clouding the air, and felt something twist deep inside me. My daughter and I had done that once. She had been so small then, squealing with delight as she balanced precariously on my hip, her fingers stretching toward the topmost bough. Now, decades later, she was the one lifting her own children to the tree. But I was not there to see it. I was on a cold sidewalk, watching strangers instead. That night, I returned home and sat in the darkened living room, staring at the bare corner where my own tree once stood. I hadn't bothered in years, telling myself it was too much trouble, but the truth was simpler. Decorating a tree alone had felt like an act of futility. But something stirred in me. Maybe it was defiance again, or maybe longing. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store and bought the smallest artificial tree they carried. I carried it into my living room, set it up in the corner, and strung it with white lights. I didn't have the energy to unpack all the ornaments, but I hung a few: the wooden dove my late husband had carved, the little felt snowman my daughter had made in second grade, the star I had bought when money was scarce but joy abundant. When the lights flickered on, the room glowed softly, and though the house was still quiet, it felt less like emptiness and more like solitude. That distinction, emptiness versus solitude, became a lifeline. Emptiness was something taken from me. Solitude was something I could choose. One felt like abandonment. The other, like possibility. Still, loneliness found its cracks. One Saturday, the phone rang. My heart leapt, irrational hope surging, only to sink when I heard the voice of a telemarketer. I laughed bitterly after hanging up, realizing how desperate I had become for the sound of my daughter's voice. Not even an apology, just acknowledgement. Proof that I hadn't been erased. But silence reigned. In that silence, I turned more to the community I had cautiously rejoined. At church, I began lingering after the service instead of slipping out. Conversations with strangers stretched longer. I was invited once to join a group of women for coffee, and though nerves pricked at me, I went. We sat in the corner of a diner, sipping weak coffee from heavy mugs, trading stories of grown children and aching knees, of recipes passed down and neighbors lost. No one asked me why I had come alone. They simply included me. That night, for the first time in a long while, I returned home and felt the warmth of belonging. Yet even as I stitched these small connections, my heart carried its wound. Christmas Eve arrived, and though I had braced myself for it, the night still hollowed me out. I imagined my daughter's house filled with noise, wrapping paper torn, stockings overturned, her children's voices filling the rooms. My own house was still, the little tree glowing faintly in the corner. I made myself a cup of cocoa, sat beneath the lights, and whispered aloud, "Merry Christmas." The words fell into the quiet, unanswered. It was on that night, as I sat staring at the tree, that I realized how much of my identity had been tethered to my daughter's recognition. For so many years, I had measured my worth in how needed I was by her. Now that she had no need for me, I found myself untethered, drifting. And perhaps, though painful, that was the lesson I had avoided facing, to find worth not in being needed, but in simply being. The weeks that followed were uneven. Some days I woke with purpose, sketching, walking, attending gatherings. Other days, I lingered in bed too long, my chest heavy with the ache of exclusion. Grief, I realized, did not vanish with distraction. It sat quietly inside, surfacing when least expected. In January, snow fell thick and quiet. I shoveled my own walkway, each heave of the shovel both exhausting and affirming. A neighbor paused to wave, his dog bounding through the drifts. "Need a hand?" he called. "No," I answered, breathless but proud. "I've got it." And I did. The ache in my shoulders lasted days, but so did the sense of self-sufficiency. Later that month, I joined a book club at the library. We read slowly, discussing chapters over tea in the community room. Some books bored me, others transported me, but what mattered most was the circle of faces each week, the chairs pulled together, the laughter over small details. I was no longer the woman left out. I was a woman who showed up, who claimed a seat. Still, the memory of Thanksgiving haunted me. One afternoon, in a weak moment, I considered calling my daughter. I rehearsed the words, "I missed you. I would have loved to be there. Can we talk?" But then I imagined her dismissive reply, the quick sigh, the subtle impatience. And I set the phone down. I would not beg for scraps. Instead, I began writing in a notebook, something I had not done since girlhood. At first, it was just fragments, lines about the cold air, about the light on the snow, about the silence of my house. But gradually, I began to write about her. About the way she once clung to my skirts, the way her hair smelled of shampoo and crayons, the way she had whispered secrets into my ear before sleep. I wrote of the first time she pulled away from my hand at the school gate, embarrassed by my presence. I wrote of graduations, of weddings, of the gradual shifting tides of closeness and distance. And I wrote of Thanksgiving morning, when she said we're full. The act of writing was both wound and balm. It hurt to put the words down, but it also gave shape to what had felt amorphous. Pain on a page became something I could see, something I could hold. By February, I noticed changes in myself. I no longer avoided the mirror. I no longer flinched at the sound of silence. I began cooking meals for one without bitterness, savoring flavors I enjoyed rather than trying to please others. I even bought a bright scarf, red and bold, something I would never have chosen before. When I wore it to church, a woman complimented me, and I laughed, a sound that felt freer than it had in months. Of course, grief lingered. One evening, I dreamed of my daughter as a child again, her small hand warm in mine. I woke with tears on my cheeks, mourning not just the woman she had become, but the girl she once was, the girl who needed me, who loved me without reservation. But when I rose that morning and turned on the porch light, I did so with steadier hands. The light was not for her. It was for me, a signal, a reminder that my life was still here, still glowing, still mine to live. And slowly, quietly, I began to believe it. By late February the snow had thinned to dirty lace at the curb, and the sky carried that watery brightness that promises spring without quite delivering it. I had grown used to my new habits: morning walks, library afternoons, church on Sundays, and most evenings I brewed a small pot of tea and turned on the porch light as if I were lighting a modest lantern inside myself. Then, on a Tuesday that felt like any other, my phone rang. Her name lit the screen. I stared at it so long I missed the first call and watched it blink out. When it rang again, I forced my thumb to move. "Mom," she said, breathless, distracted. "Our sitter is sick. There's a school meeting and I can't bring the kids. Could you?" She didn't finish. She didn't say please. The words hung there, practical and bare. I took a breath that felt like stepping onto thin ice. "I can," I answered, keeping my voice even. "But before you drop them, I need you to know something. Thanksgiving hurt me." "I won't pretend it didn't." A pause, the soft static of a car heater on her end. "I know it wasn't ideal," she said quickly. "We had a lot of people. It was chaotic." "I understand chaos," I said. "I've cooked through it my whole life. This wasn't chaos. It was a choice. I'll watch them tonight, because I love them. But we will talk after." Another pause, longer this time. "Fine," she said, clipped. "I'll be there in 20. I hung up and stood a moment with both hands on the counter, feeling the tremor beneath my ribs settle. It surprised me that the tremor wasn't fear, it was steadiness arriving late. I cleared the table, set out 2 small plates for sandwiches and a bowl for apple slices, my movements unhurried, the small domestic sounds unexpectedly gentle. When the doorbell rang, I wiped my hands and went to open it. The children tumbled in with the cold, their cheeks flushed, the girl's hat sliding over one eye, the boy talking too loudly because he was excited to be anywhere different. My daughter stood behind them, her face powdered with fatigue. We looked at each other for a beat that held too much history. She glanced over my shoulder, into the tidy hallway that smelled faintly of lemon oil and tea, and then kissed the children. "Be good," she said, not to me, but to them. "I'll be back by 8. Her gaze flicked to mine and stopped just short of apology. She turned and was gone. It is a miracle, the way children make a house feel inhabited. Within minutes there were coats on chairs and crayons rolling under the radiator, a sock abandoned like a tiny flag on the stairs. We made grilled cheese and cut the sandwiches into triangles. The boy dipped his into ketchup with an intensity that made me smile. The girl discovered my basket of buttons and arranged them by color on the table, as if she were sorting small moons. When they finished, I set an apple on the cutting board and sliced it carefully, placing the pieces in a blue bowl I had once saved for guests who no longer came. After dinner we read. I pulled an old picture book from the shelf, its spine dreaded with tape, and settled onto the sofa with both of them leaning against me, heavy and warm and trusting in that unthinking way children possess. Halfway through, the girl looked up at me and asked, mouth still shiny with apple, "Why didn't you come on Thanksgiving?" The question knocked the breath from me precisely because it was gentle. I smoothed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I wasn't invited," I said, and kept my voice soft. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes with our calendars and our hearts. She frowned, considering this. "Can you come next time?" "If there's room," I said, smiling a little so that hope wouldn't feel like a threat. "Next time we will do our best to make room." They stayed until 9, not 8, and even then my daughter arrived in a flurry of apology that never turned into words. The children chattered about grilled cheese and buttons, and she nodded, distracted, already tugging hats on, zipping coats. I fetched a small container of soup I had made that afternoon and pushed it toward her. "Take this," I said. You'll be hungry later. She hesitated, then took it, our fingers brushing at the lid. Thank you, she said, and in the bare space where her eyes met mine I saw something flicker, shame, or perhaps simple awareness that gratitude costs so little and yet she had mortgaged it too often. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and shifted the bag on her shoulder. We'll talk, she said, looking past me. Soon. When the door closed and the house fell quiet, I stood for a long time in the entryway, listening to the echo of their voices recede across the street. I picked up a mitten left behind and laid it on the hall table, an absurd little monument to the evening. Then I turned off the overhead light and left the porch lamp glowing against the dark, its circle of warmth a small defiance. I washed the plates, drying each one fully instead of letting them air dry as I often did when it was only me. There is ceremony even in small things, and that night I needed a ceremony that said I had welcomed joy into my rooms and it had behaved itself. After that, the days moved differently. Not lighter, not cured, there is no curing the long, dull ache of a door that should have opened and didn't, but steadier. I began to invite people in, not as a replacement for family, but as a declaration that I would not wait indefinitely in a house set like a stage for a play whose actors never arrived. I asked 2 women from church to come on Sunday for soup. I told the librarian who always commented on my books to bring a loaf of bread if she had time, and if she didn't, to come anyway and eat mine. I knocked on my neighbor's door and asked the man with the bounding dog if he and his wife might like a warm bowl after their walk. He blinked in surprise, then smiled as if I had handed him a map out of his own winter. On the first Sunday in March, they came carrying small things, carrots peeled in a plastic container, a wedge of cheese, a handful of parsley held like a bouquet. We set everything on the counter and moved around each other in that gentle choreography that happens when strangers decide not to be strangers anymore. I ladled soup into bowls and someone lit a candle without asking, the sulfur strike of the match quick and familiar. We sat and ate and told the kind of stories that occupy the middle ground between intimacy and caution, old jobs, recipes from grandmothers, the way our city smells like rain even when it hasn't rained. I watched their faces warm in the candlelight and felt something in my chest unclench. At one point the librarian, her name is Ruth, touched the rim of her bowl and said, I always forget how good simple food can be when you don't eat it alone. We all laughed, not because it was a joke, but because a clean truth will draw a quiet laugh from a room. I looked at the mismatched chairs I had pulled from every corner, the extra spoons that didn't match the forks, the wrinkled napkins, and I thought of that other sentence, we're full. I realized I had created my own fullness here, not the crowded chaos of obligation, but a table wide enough for whomever arrived with an honest appetite. When they had gone and the candle had burned down to a stub, I stood at the sink in the hush that follows company, washing bowls one by one, feeling the ease of useful tiredness in my shoulders. The porch light still shone. The mitten was still on the table by the door, waiting to be reclaimed. I dried my hands and checked my phone out of habit. There was a message from my daughter, a picture of the children asleep in the back seat, their mouths tilted open in the unguarded way of childhood. Under it, one word, thanks. No period. No apology. But gratitude, however spare, is its own kind of hinge. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway, looking back at the room. The chairs were askew, crumbs gathered where elbows had rested, the air holding the last faint residue of onion and stock. I felt the ache and the strength at once, braided together so tightly I could not have separated them if I tried. I touched the switch and left the porch light on, not as a beacon for anyone in particular, but as a steady note I could hear when the rest of the song faltered. In bed, I thought about the conversation we would have, my daughter and I. I did not script it. I did not practice lines like a nervous actor coming late to a role. I knew only what I would not do. I would not beg. I would not bargain. I would not shape myself smaller to fit a table already laid for others. I would say what was true and leave room for what she might say back. Room, that was the word I kept turning over like a smooth stone in my palm. Not fullness that shuts doors, but room that allows a chair to be pulled up without resentful shuffling. Room for her to be the mother she is now. Room for me to be more than an empty seat. Before sleep found me, I whispered into the dim room, the way I have learned to speak to myself on nights when the past crowds the doorway. You didn't disappear, I said. You lit the light. You set the table you have. And in that small, private benediction, I felt the house ease around me, as if it, too, understood that belonging sometimes begins with the sound of your own voice saying you are here. The thaw came slowly, one hesitant drip from the eaves at a time, one patch of grass surfacing from beneath the crust of snow. By mid-March, the mornings no longer bit at my fingers when I opened the curtains, and the air carried a faint smell of damp earth. I found myself moving through my days with more steadiness than before, though there were still hours when memory pressed against me like a bruise that hadn't fully faded. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, while I was sweeping the porch, that my daughter came. No call ahead, no text. Just her car pulling into the drive, the sound of the engine cutting, and then her figure emerging with shoulders hunched as if bracing against weather that wasn't there. For a moment, I considered pretending not to notice. But the truth is, I had been waiting for this, perhaps not expecting it, but ready in the quiet way you prepare for something you know must come. She climbed the steps slowly, her eyes flicking to the light I had already switched on, though the sun was still high. You always leave that on now, she said, her voice softer than it had been on Thanksgiving morning. I do, I replied. It reminds me that light doesn't need a reason. It just shines. For a second, she seemed about to argue, then stopped. She leaned against the railing, arms folded, her face lined with the strain of balancing too many things. The kids, they loved being here the other night. They've been asking when they can come again. They're always welcome, I said. My hands tightened around the broom handle. I wanted to leave it at that, to let the small kindness stand unspoiled. But the ache inside me would not permit silence anymore. But you and I, before anything else, we need to speak plainly. She winced, her jaw tightening. I know, she said. I've been meaning to. I cut gently across her words. Don't soften it with meanings. Just say it. On Thanksgiving, you told me there was no room. Do you know what that did to me? Her eyes darted away, to the yard, to the road, anywhere but my face. Mom, it wasn't meant to be cruel. We had too many people. The house was crowded. I didn't think. That's exactly it, I said, laying the broom down carefully against the wall. You didn't think. Not about me, not about what it feels like to be told that a table you helped teach me to set all those years has no chair for you. It was 4 words to you. But to me, it was being erased. She swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. The silence stretched, filled with the sound of a distant car horn and a bird calling overhead. Then, almost reluctantly, she whispered, I'm sorry. It wasn't grand, it wasn't tearful. Just 2 words, so quiet I had to lean toward them. And yet, they cracked something in me. Not because they erased the pain, they didn't, but because at last they named it. I nodded slowly. That's all I needed. Not excuses. Not reasons. Just acknowledgement. She shifted her weight, as if unburdened slightly, but still restless. I don't know how to fix what's been broken between us. Neither do I said honestly. But we can start by not pretending it isn't broken. That's the only way it might heal. Her eyes filled then, not spilling over, just shining. I don't want the kids to grow up thinking it's normal to leave people out. I don't want them to think I forgot who taught me how to cook a turkey in the first place. A breath left me I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Then let them see us try again. Not perfect, not pretending. Just trying. She nodded, small and hesitant, but it was enough. That evening, after she left, I stood at my window watching the glow of my porch light. The house felt different, not because everything was resolved, but because the silence between us had shifted from denial to possibility. I realized that healing wasn't about erasing the hurt. It was about choosing to set a chair again, even if the legs were wobbly. Over the next weeks, she did bring the children more often. Sometimes she came inside for tea, sometimes she lingered on the porch while they played in the yard. We spoke awkwardly at first, circling safe topics: school, weather, the price of groceries. But gradually, honesty crept in. One afternoon, she admitted how overwhelmed she often felt, how she used my absence not to punish me but to carve out space for herself. "It wasn't fair," she said quietly. "I pushed you away because I thought it would make things easier." It didn't. I listened, not absolving, but understanding. "I can't be your solution," I told her. "But I don't want to be your scapegoat either." And in her eyes, I saw recognition, a flicker that told me perhaps she was beginning to see me not as the endless reservoir of patience and sacrifice, but as a woman in her own right, flawed and still learning. Easter came, and for the first time in years she asked if I would come to their house. I hesitated, the memory of Thanksgiving still raw, but then I remembered the children's eager faces and the promise we had begun to make. "Yes," I said at last. "But only if there is truly room." "There is," she whispered. "This time, there is." I went, carrying a pie. I walked into a house filled with noise and clutter and the smell of ham roasting, and though my place was smaller than it once was, it was mine. Not perfect, not easy, but real. That night, back in my own quiet home, I sat at my table beneath the soft glow of the porch light. I thought about the plates I had set on Thanksgiving, the candle burning alone, the hollow ache of exclusion. I thought about the soup shared with neighbors, the laughter of strangers made into friends. And I thought about my daughter's tentative apology, fragile but sincere. It struck me then that life had not given me one table, but many. Some I had been pushed from, others I had built myself. And the measure of my days was not whether I was always invited, but whether I kept setting plates, whether I kept leaving the light on. I lifted my cup of tea and whispered softly, not to anyone else but to myself, "You did not disappear." And in that moment, I believed it. Spring settled in with soft rains that tapped gently at the windows, coaxing green back into the trees. Life outside returned in bursts of color, and within me, something mirrored that renewal. My daughter and I were not healed completely. Old wounds don't vanish with a single apology, but we were speaking again, cautiously, like two people learning to walk across a fragile bridge. The children's laughter in my house softened the sharp edges of memory, and when I looked at my daughter now, I saw not only the hurt she had caused but also the woman still trying, still imperfect, still mine. Yet I had also learned something beyond her reach. That winter had taught me my survival was not tethered to anyone's invitation. I could make a home full with soup, books, laughter, and even silence. I could be more than what was withheld from me. One evening, as twilight folded itself across the yard, I switched on the porch light. It glowed steady against the gathering dark, not waiting for anyone in particular, but burning anyway, because that is what I had become. A light that endures. A presence that remains.